President Trump has some bad news for NPR and PBS. Trump ordered the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to end its funding of the two outlets. Trump wrote in his order, "At the very least, Americans have the right to expect that if their tax dollars fund public broadcasting at all, they fund only fair, accurate, unbiased, and nonpartisan news coverage."
NPR responded to the news, writing in a statement, "Eliminating funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting would have a devastating impact on American communities across the nation that rely on public radio for trusted local and national news, culture, life-saving emergency alerts, and public safety information."
Executive Director for Foundation for Freedom Online, Mike Benz, wrote on X, "It's obvious to the point of tautology that if more than half of the country hates your news slant, more than half of the country should not be forced to pay for it."
On the other hand, editor of the Left Hook Substack, Wajahat Ali, wrote on Blue Sky, "Trump is about to do for NPR and PBS what he did for the Canadian Liberals."
Oh, and look, I think that would be fine, right? If NPR and PBS want to be liberal outlets, then they're allowed to do that, but the taxpayer should not have to fund it. And I know that women in DC everywhere are clutching their NPR tote bags with a death grip right now, but to me, this is long overdue.
Well, look, NPR has 1% of its budget come from federal funding. It is almost entirely from member donations and from sponsorships. But here's the problem. There's 246 local stations in the NPR network that are not political shows that people object to, or they're not even the news that folks think have some kind of slant, which I don't think they do, obviously. But they are local news. It's weather, it's public safety information. That's largely where the federal dollars go. That's stuff that people will miss, especially in rural communities where it's really hard to build an infrastructure. And if you just rely on what you can do on the corporate side, they're going to go to the big markets, and what's left behind are people in the middle of the country that need that for agricultural purposes, for public safety purposes, and just to cover the local stories happening in their community.
I'm actually amenable to the idea of keeping funding for the local stations and just cutting it off from the federal public broadcasting outlets.
That's what it is, though, for the most part.
What do you mean?
The 1% of the budget that goes there really does go to fund those local stations, and the very little bit of that comes to maybe the national shows.
Right, but then cut out the middleman, right? Give it directly to the local stations so that NPR doesn't get the money. And if it's only 1% that NPR is getting anyway, then they don't really need it for their operations. So let's give the money directly to the local outlets that are not doing the political slant. And you know what? I'm a donor to KET, so like
Excellent.
I get it. I'm a huge fan.
Do you have the tote?
No, I do not have a tote. We do have a sticker on our fridge. But I think, it really is about NPR and PBS. And for the past 10, 20 years, these outlets, to me, have become unrecognizable. And the White House sent out a fact sheet this morning with some examples of the bias. And it's like 6 pages long. And I'm just reading through this. And they're linking to, obviously, publicly reported stories, apologizing for calling illegal immigrants illegal, featured a Valentine's Day story around queer animals, devoted a panel to white privilege. I mean, this is not something that most Americans want their taxpayer dollars helping to support.
Well, again, I don't think those kind of stories, the national network is being funded by taxpayer dollars largely. And secondly, look, there's a lot of content in the world. If you're talking about, a news network that has 246 stations, a national network, and also this need to broadcast consistently, are you going to find and be able to cherry pick some examples of a story or two or a slant or two that gets people irate and upset? Sure you will. But when I listen to NPR, one of the things they do that I really love and I think is so important is that if they have a story where any facet of that story touches some part of their funding, whether it's a federal government funding, whether it's a grant from a foundation, they will name that and list that at the top of the story as they go into it.
Well, that's basic journalistic ethics.
It doesn't happen very often when I see it on Fox News or on other networks, right? So they do this, I think, consistently in a way that does create a measure of trust and a lack of bias. And they report stories, I think, in this cadence and this fact-driven way that lets people access deeper what's really going on. Now, sure, there can be some anchors, some programs that come in with a perspective. There are some where it's less about straight news and more about opinion. But again, those are largely funded by member contributions and not by the federal government. The federal government's funding really the network, which is about a public service.
It's really not cherry picking, though, when the editor-in-chief, Catherine Marr, goes to testify in front of Congress and they're reading tweets to her. Congressman Brandon Gill has this list of tweets about white privilege and hating Trump and threats to democracy. And her excuse is, well, I don't remember saying that. or I didn't mean it when I said it. I mean, I think you would agree that it's a serious problem if the editor-in-chief of a news outlet is openly sharing these incredibly progressive opinions on social media and expecting that that's not going to color her coverage or the coverage of her employees.
Yep.
And the fact that she doesn't even admit to believing these things. So what, you just say things on social media that you don't believe? I mean, at the very least, Catherine Marr needs to get the heck out.
I will agree with you on this point. I think if you're going to have the public trust as part of your mandate, whether you're funded by the federal government or whether you're in the federal government or you're in some other public institution, you have a higher standard to keep yourself above the fray. You can believe things, and everyone comes into their job, everybody, with some measure of bias and some level of opinion, and that's not cause for me to cut federal funding. Now, at the same time, can I say that someone in that position should be more careful with what they put out online, because that can certainly be used to imply some bias? Absolutely, they have to stay above the fray, and she didn't. That's a fair point. But at the end of the day, I don't think you cut the funding to local outlets reporting on weather and public emergencies because of that misjudgment. That's just not the right way to approach this.
I think the other important piece of context here is that in regards to the 1% number when it comes to NPR, those local outlets also pay for the licensing fees, which end up actually making up about 14 to 15% of the total NPR budget. So again, I think cutting out the middleman, giving these local outlets access to the licensing on their own through federal dollars, allowing them to continue to operate without having to give a kickback to NPR would solve a lot of this problem for most people.
Well, look, all this is expensive. Infrastructure in local communities across the country and rural communities is really hard to build. And I'm pretty sympathetic to the overall cost of building and maintaining a media apparatus that can do good reporting, do good sourcing, have the infrastructure to broadcast it and reach people. That stuff is not done very easily. I'm loath to micromanage how they've done the license fees and use the grant funding and the federal funding to make all that work. But look, if we want to have a really good conversation about how to make sure that people in America can get news they can rely on, that is unbiased, that's trusted, that gets them the information that lets them live their lives more safely and more comfortably, we should have that conversation. But that involves, to me, further infrastructure build out on broadband, further infrastructure build out on how to access these stations, and expansion of that. It doesn't involve cutting and cherry picking some stories to make a political point.
I disagree with the cherry picking. I think it's pretty pervasive, but that's fair. I mean, you obviously come at this from a different political perspective than I do. But the other element of this that we should probably mention is that this would probably have to be done through a rescission process, because the Corporation for Public Broadcasting has funding doled out by Congress for 2 years. So the executive order is obviously going to be challenged in court, but also on the grounds that Congress has to have exercise some control over this.
And they should. There's a role for Congress to have the purse strings and to control the budget, with the executive proposing and the Congress then actually executing on that faction. And on PBS, which we didn't talk about that much, look, people really enjoy the broadcasting that they put out there, especially for kids. And Sesame Street and other programs like that are kind of a vital part of how kids in this country grow up. I think people in this country are not going to be excited about cuts to that kind of programming.
I think the good news is that if people are really excited about these networks and the shows that they have, if Trump does cut this funding, I see no problem with them being able to raise the funds through donations to make up that deficit.
That could be.
All right, up next on Rising, lawmakers traveling to El Salvador. Is it a protest or a political stunt?